Hey everybody, welcome to Binkhorsts and Blockbusters. I'm Cait,
And I'm Garrett.
and today we are continuing our War on Christmas with a medieval movie set in the 1290s, a classic, very long 90s movie, Braveheart.
Yes, this is also another Best Picture winner. I think we're 3 for 3 on our War on Christmas Best Picture winners.
Oh wow, yeah. That's an intriguing coincidence.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Saving Private Ryan didn't win one, but posthumously everybody agreed it did. So we're gonna say it did. That's the official stance of the podcast.
Yeah, and it's the only one that should have, so. Eh.
Yeah. I mean, compared to what was coming out in 1995, Braveheart kind of lucked out. Yeah, in the running for Best Picture was also another George Miller production, Babe, the first Babe movie, the ones about the pig. That's what it was up
Hmm.
against. Uh,
I like the pig.
well, 1994 was a fantastic year for movies. 95, not so much. But this is one of the better ones from that time period.
I mean, I guess.
But before we talk too much about Braveheart and Mel Gibson and swords and historical inaccuracies, I've been watching a new show on HBO Max.
Cool.
Yeah, it's called Scavengers Reign. It is a story that follows the aftermath of a space frigate crash, and there are a bunch of survivors that are on this strange alien planet trying to get to the crash site and trying to get home. And it's animated, it's very visually appealing. And, I was trying to like sum up my feelings about it. In many ways, I think it's like the most realized like sci-fi world I've seen in media since like, back when Avatar was out. Just in
Hmm.
terms of like, there's an ecology here, there's like a mystery behind how everything works. Um, it's a very visually appealing and fun, but also scary place. Um, and it does something very cool, which is it uses biomes and like different locations that the characters have to go through as a part of their challenges to get, to survive.
Wow.
Unlike Star Wars, where every planet is one biome, this one has hundreds.
Hmm. Interesting.
It's kind of out there, but if you're not entertained by the first episode, it's only 30 minutes. It's quite a bit of fun, and the music's really good.
Well, that's good. We do love some good music.
Yes. Um, Otherwise, I think we both watched The Gilded Age this week, but not a whole lot interesting has happened, so we'll probably come back to that in a few weeks.
Yeah.
Uh, Otherwise, I don't have anything more to add.
Okay, well let's get into Braveheart then.
Yes. So, as mentioned before, this is a Best Picture winner. This is directed by and starring Mel Gibson and was released in May of 1995 to critical success.
So he was the director and the lead actor?
Yes, he was doing both. I know he's directed several movies. In 2016, his like return to Hollywood was directing Hacksaw Ridge, which is another really successful and critically acclaimed war movie. Um,
Hmm.
and I think he directed Passion of the Christ. Um, that'll come up here in a minute.
Ah, yeah. I
Uh,
I can say these movies have some similarities.
yes. Um, Braveheart follows the story of William Wallace, who is a figure in Scotland's history and fighting in the War of Independence against the English. Uh, this is a subject that probably not a lot of people know about because it happened 800 years ago. Um, So this film was responsible for bringing a lot of like interest and, you know, excitement around these mythical figures and like kings and knights and stuff. It was filmed primarily in Scotland and Ireland in 1994, and in the following years after the release, it was responsible for a huge boom in Scotland's tourism. In 1996, they held a Braveheart conference, which is something they hold apparently very regularly. But after the release of the movie, the reception had tripled in size, and there were over 160,000 people who came for, you know, the festivals and conferences and talks. Historians, some people who worked on the film have attended in subsequent years. So, you know, it's a big deal over there.
Yeah, medieval reenactment is pretty fun too. So I'm sure that was had something to do with it.
Yeah, and this movie pulls on so much quote unquote history that like it kind of doesn't matter what you do, you're going to be accurate to the movie, but you're not going to be accurate to the real world.
That is totally true. And it also has like a lot of the like romantic things that people like about the Middle Ages. And whether or not those are true, we will get into.
Yeah. Um, so 40% of the attendants at this conference who saw the movie said it influenced them to visit the event or to visit Scotland in general. And that's pretty astounding that the movie has such a wide reach. Um, However, this is some people, some critics have theorized it led to an uptick in Scottish nationalism, and they've called the film Anglophobic, which is just saying racism against English, which is, I think, kind of ridiculous. Um, I don't think there's anything necessarily in the film that preaches you as a modern day viewer to see it like that, but rather from a historical context to see like a group of oppressed people.
Yeah, and the movie goes out of its way to make the Scottish people look disheveled and unclean and unorganized and bad at everything,
Hmm.
as opposed to the English that are just, you know, marching around like the English do, um, and who are cultured with their French wives and their fancy courts. Um, so, and that was something that kind of struck me is, you know, in that they are an oppressed people and they're also depicted as, you know, slovenly. So, eh, I don't know.
Yeah, very strange. Um, so Mel Gibson was responsible for directing and starring and producing this film. He sought funding himself. He was going to cut a deal with Warner Brothers, who were going to fund it, but only if he agreed to make a fourth Lethal Weapon film. There were already three out at the time. He would go on to make the fourth film anyway, irrespective of this deal. But he sought funding with Paramount and Fox for the distribution rights, and they each took cut of the bill. Um, I guess before we go on too much further, we should address something that we brought up in one of the episodes we did on the Continental about Mel Gibson and being canceled. Um, Mel Gibson has struggled with alcoholism for most of his life, and as a result, he's made a number of homophobic and anti-Semitic comments, also some racist things as well. So not a lot of nothing really redeeming there. In 2006, he was arrested for a DUI, where he made those anti-Semitic comments as he attempted to be suicided by cop. This is considered a really low point in his life and career. He went on to apologize on television, and he met with the Jewish community to find a way to, I guess, atone. He also went to rehab later that year. But troubles continued. He has some domestic abuse charges laid against him. But after 10 years, he regained some favor in Hollywood and went on to direct Hacksaw Ridge. Um, you know, we talk a lot about artists and characters in films, and it's very tough, you know, to talk about, you know, something he made so many years before all these events without bringing this up.
Yeah, and alcoholism and substance abuse, they are serious diseases that, certainly don't excuse behavior, but you know, it's something to consider in that. But yeah, you just don't turn on being a, racist, homophobic, anti-Semitic person overnight either.
Yeah, that's
So
true. Uh, I mean, in this day and age, you know, I'm just reminded of somebody on Twitter a couple weeks ago, another comedian. I forget who, so I don't want to say it and be wrong, but they made anti-Semitic comments and then blamed being really high on marijuana for it. And I've got to say, I've never done drugs enough that I suddenly became a total piece of shit. So I don't know.
yeah, it's more of a symptom of a longer condition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So with that being said, let's say this other thing.
Oh, so Prima Nocta. Um,
I thought that was an okay transition, but okay.
oh, I didn't know where you were going with that. Oh, yeah, where were you going with that transition? I
I
am
w-
very
I, w-
confused.
I was saying, okay, we've said things. Now we're gonna say some more stuff. That's all I was going for.
Okay, we're professionals here, everybody. So the whole premise of this movie is based on the idea that the Scottish people decided to revolt because of this idea of Prima Nocta that the English had enacted, and they were oppressing the Scottish people for many years and, allowing their nobles to sleep with their wives on their wedding nights in order to have more English babies. Which, when you think about it, if the baby is born to a Scottish household, it doesn't really matter if they were English blood to begin with. So it's just nonsense. Um, but we're going to spend some time talking about historical realities here. This didn't actually happen at ever. There's no documentation that this ever was a policy that any European country did, or their rulers, or anybody. It was one of those things, and there are many things that happened in the 13th or the 14th century where people would say that their neighbors were doing a thing, and this was one of them. You tell your people that, oh, those nasty English are doing Prima Nocta over there, so you better be good and fight for us in our wars and stuff. They also did this with the plagues and cannibalism. They would say that, the town over there was eating their babies because they were hungry and dying of the plague, but that never actually happened. There's no actual evidence of cannibalism, and we've looked at enough plague corpses to determine that. You like when people are cannibalized, you can look at their bones and see that they were eaten. It's a
Oh,
thing.
wonderful.
Yeah, there's like 5 instances of cannibalism in Western society ever. Like it's really tiny. Um, and I've always found that to be fascinating because people are always saying, like, historically in letters, and like, like these things would be kept in monasteries and abbeys and all kinds of stuff like that, and they would say, "Oh, so and so is cannibalizing so and so over there," but it never happened. Prima
I,
Nocta is the same thing.
I mean, it's really is a great way to convey that somebody is so evil that they partake in such practices. So, it makes sense why these rumors get spread.
Yeah. Yeah. So it kind of annoys me that this was the, opening presence to the movie when so this movie takes place largely in the 1290s, and that was a fantastic time in history. And as a medievalist obsessed person, like, there's so many cool things going on in this period to talk about. So,
Like what?
in the Americas, for whatever reason, several groups were doing some massive deforestation projects where they just burned down forests. And that caused a lot of CO2 to be released in the atmosphere. Concurrently, in Indonesia, you have a massive, massive volcanic explosion. It's one of those that like shakes the whole world.
Hmm.
And that also creates a, darkening to the atmosphere. And suddenly we go from being the warming period of the medieval times, where you have just an abundance of food. Farming technology is happening at an explosive rate. You have, families having 12, 15 kids and them all surviving to adulthood, which is like round of applause,
Wow.
everybody. Like
Great
we're
work.
doing stuff. So there, and we know how abundant it was, not just on the records, but because there were monasteries that had, 40, 50,000 people living in them.
Wow.
And those were all, kids that the family didn't need anymore. You didn't send your kids to the monastery if you could use them on the farm. So there was just a great abundant period happening in medieval Europe, and it starts ending in the mid 1200s and continues to get bad up until 1300, where shit hits the fan. You get hurricanes, you get floods. In Holland, every year 20,000 people were dying of floods. It was bad. It was really bad.
Damn.
There was a great famine in 1315 that killed off a ton of people, whole generation of children just gone, mess, and then you get the plague coming. So, and that's in the 20s. So you have, this is just a miserable time to be alive.
Right. I was gonna say the plague must have been right around his time, so right after.
Yeah, so it would have been after, but Scotland being farther north would have faced the effects of the general cooling period before other places like Spain and France.
Hmm.
Um, so it probably was bad there more than it was bad in England. So like farming and stuff would have started to get bad in Scotland in this time period, which would explain a lot of the issues. So you have the English coming in out of nowhere because they have a power gap, because suddenly the king didn't have any kids in Scotland. And that was the problem. All his kids died. He had no heirs. They had to pick somebody, and they trusted the English king to come in and help them make a decision. Bad idea.
Yeah, so that's really what kicks off this story is having
Yeah.
having Longshanks.
And my other issue is that the way that it happens in the movie, where they just go in and they kill all the aldermen or whatever in a barn, is not anywhere close to what happened. Like they had actual battles and stuff. So, and they had, pretender rulers, and there was vying for power and all those kinds of things that would have been fun to watch, instead of this stupid idea of like, oh, the English guy, my wife. And that yeah, that this whole thing made me mad.
Yeah, so I've got to say, I thought the whole reason of introducing Prima Nocta was so that way, like Mel Gibson, he gets married and then like he gets cucked and he's not having it, and then that's like what incites the violence, his tyranny. Because like that would make sense from like a very masculine angle, but instead he's doing the violence because one of the soldiers sexually assaults his wife, which is equally terrible, but less of an affront against the king itself. Until you get to the point where they say assaulting a knight or is equivalent to assaulting the king himself, and that's punishable by death.
Yeah. Well, and I think that the dumb thing is they could have taken out the whole prima nocta concept, that whole wedding, in the
Yeah,
beginning, all of that, and still have her be assaulted by the English guard, and we would have felt the same thing.
yeah. So I I really struggled to get into this movie to begin with. It's the first 45 minutes are very long and boring. That's when the inciting incident happens, is 45 minutes in. So I wasn't really paying attention, so I stopped watching it. And then I've gone somewhere else, and I'm now using a different person's Amazon, and I go on there to watch Braveheart, and we had both given up watching it at the same part, which is which is roughly that. So I just started theirs up, and it was the same time. Um, very,
That's funny.
yeah, I thought that was hilarious. Uh, we're going to talk later about how much of this movie could be cut down, but this this whole inciting thing is very boring compared to reality.
Yeah, and I mean, while it does create the emotional, like, that sadness and that
Yes.
feeling of unjustness, and like, I was kind of on board with it, like, as like, oh, that's so sweet. And then, a quick Google, and I'm like, well, shit, not this crap again. Because there's a lot of things that, modern culture has said that medieval people did all the time.
Hmm.
And a lot of it happens in this movie, and that really bothers me. And even in the 90s, everybody knew enough to not make these poor choices. It's not like, we just discovered that, like Vikings were in America, or something like that, which we've known since like the 30s. But they knew this stuff, and they either intentionally ignored it all or intentionally did it to, make a point, or in the movie without, that has just no realm of historical accuracy whatsoever.
Yeah, they do a lot of that here to just either get an emotional response, well, primarily to get an emotional response or a cool visual.
I mean, the visuals were not that cool. I
Some
mean,
of,
look at the people on the screen. They look cool.
yeah, so this is something we brought up, I think, when we were talking about Wheel of Time, is that like everybody dresses the same and they all are just in different colors of brown. Like you would know more about this than I do, but like people wore colors.
Yeah, yeah, they did. And if we want to go to the next slide, we can
Okay.
talk about the Stinky Scotsmen. Because, so my number two biggest complaint about this movie was the portrayal of the Scotsman as this dirty, unkempt, like badly clothed, barely clothed, like wild man with
Yeah.
their hair. Like, what
Yeah.
what was that hair? The
It was all over the
hair.
place.
Oh my God. There are Viking shows trying to do that do a better job. I mean, so to like bring this back historically, we have no evidence that the people in Scotland at this time period were wearing any different clothes than the people in Ireland and England and France. In Spain, they were wearing weird things, but we can ignore that. Um, so and they had the same armor, they had the same, the same tools, they had the same clothes, and they didn't wear kilts in this time period. They didn't wear tartans. It wasn't a thing yet. That's a much later development. So the whole kilt scene is dumb, in my opinion. The other
Yeah,
thing that,
yeah. In more ways than one. It's really dumb, it's immature, but also historically inaccurate.
yeah, and it presents them as these, like, unsophisticated peoples, which, sure, a lot of them couldn't read. Sure, a lot of them maybe didn't understand the Latin of a liturgical service, but these were devoutly Catholic people, and they were going to church every day, and they were wearing clothes. And so the anger that I felt upon seeing young William Wallace in the opening scene wearing that torn tunic and like all dirty with the mullet, that is absolutely not what a child in 1287 would have looked like anywhere in Europe. I mean, maybe a homeless child. Like, You would take care of your clothes. If you had a hole in your clothes, you would patch the clothes. And for kids, they would do the same thing because you had to have such reverence for these, things. And if your kid looked like that, people would make fun of you.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And these people would be clean. Like, okay, little kid playing out in the mud, fine, maybe not the cleanest, but everybody else would have washed.
Yeah, I mean, even especially the scene that sticks out in my mind is the funeral scene because they all look dirty. And sure, there's someone digging a hole, but like you would think even for that, especially with how Christian and that like there would be some cleanliness involved.
Yeah, and the whole misnomer that medieval people were, stinky and didn't wash is just completely inaccurate. Like in church services, if you've ever been to church, there's a moment where before the Eucharist, the priest will wash his hands in water and then dry them on a white linen towel. That's something they've done forever. In the 1200s, they made these fun, cool water pitchers that were shaped like animals, and they used those specifically as hand washing vessels. They weren't for wine, they weren't for any beer or anything like that. They were specifically for hand washing.
Oh,
We
that's
know
cool.
hand washing was super important. And like they just completely, make the Scotsmen to be these dirty, unkempt people. Like, sure, the soldiers probably said, really, brash things to each other and made dirty jokes and all of those kinds of things. Um, and the English soldiers, when they were occupying areas, they were probably, not being nice. They were probably assaulting women. Like that part is probably totally true.
Oh yeah, 100%.
The wedding scene, like that should have happened in a church. There were also like really nice churches in Scotland. There were really nice buildings. There were bridges. Like this wasn't a bunch of dirt hovels, which they made it seem out to be.
They were
And William
stone.
Wallace, yeah, I mean he's also a nobleman. He should be living in a real house. Like, oh my gosh, this just made me very angry.
Yeah, it was weird when the first thing I looked up is I saw he was a knight, and then there's a scene where he gets knighted, but like there's never a scene where even the king looks like he's in a real castle. Because I like castles, I like buildings, and they weren't bare stone, they were plastered, and usually on that plaster there was like art. Even if
Hmm.
it was simple, it wouldn't be like the Sistine Chapel, but there would be art on the walls. It's obviously faded over time, and what we're left with are, yeah, bare stone ruins, but like it would have been a much more nicer, homelier place than these like just barren stone halls that they're held up in.
Yeah, and the fun thing is that during the Reformation years, the a lot of Protestant religions took offense to how many people looked at images and venerated them as idols, and that's always been a problem in the Christian church. There's been many times where they've gone in and destroyed paintings for various reasons. Mostly it's about, idolizing different people. And that happened in Europe just like tenfold in the 1500s. So we did lose so many painted walls of churches and just paintings, like they were just burned in the streets because people thought that they were idols. Which on one hand, stuff was getting out of hand. On the other hand, burning art, not great. I don't like that as an art historian. And this is one of the reasons why English art specifically is very hard to find for the medieval period, because they really did go around and destroy it all. When King Henry VIII went around and uh, like, he took all the monasteries and abbeys back into crown hands, and he like
Hmm.
disbanded a lot of them. And during that time, he burnt a lot of stuff. A lot of paintings, a lot of, like saint things. Like he didn't want the church to have so much power, and they had so much power because they had so much shiny things, and they had so many shiny things because people whose kids all died in the plague used their money to buy shining things for the church. So,
Okay.
yeah. Very interesting stuff. But I did think that the English, so the stuff that the English are wearing, the soldiers' uniforms with the tabards and the chainmail, not terrible. The king in his little tabard, not terrible. The queen, a princess, whatever, her hair was okay, a good 50% of the time, mostly through the first part of the movie. I give that a thumbs up. The second part of the movie, ugh, I don't, that whole love thing, I don't get it.
No,
The
that was
whole
bad.
the weenie prince guy, that was bad. I mean, this was a time period in England which didn't happen again for a long time, where you had a relatively stable, intelligent ruler. And I mean, I'm not saying Longshanks was a good guy. He was objectively bad guy, but he wasn't completely insane or, had some kind of mental issue or, illness. I mean, which is kind of hard to come by in a lot of these royal bloodlines, and it certainly
Yes.
comes out in the next 100 years after this.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, the portrayal of Longshanks's son as being very effeminate was another criticism against the film. And another thing that like made people say his depiction was homophobic in some way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Mel Gibson said that they had a few more scenes, one to put in the beginning of the movie that would have made his character have a bit more, I hesitate to say agency, but have a bit more like presence. But they cut that out.
Well, I think that part of the problem is just the premise to begin with, that this guy was a weak guy, and they could have done that through so many different ways. Like they could have shown that he had no interest in war things. They could have shown that he had interest, but he was just bad at it. They could have shown that he was, controlled by his wife.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a valid, situation that could have happened in this area because, even though this wife being from France, completely made up, not accurate at all.
Yeah, I thought that was a bit confusing because they say he was at war with France and that this
Yes.
was the daughter of the King of France. I forget what they say in the movie.
It's very confusing. I think they say she's the daughter of the king, and they've kind of like brokered her for a peace. But so the issue here is that France in general is not the same shape as we think of France today. I mean, France has
Oh,
always been that shape. But in the 1190s, the king and his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, got a divorce, and it turned out that she actually owned the western portion of France, and she went and married the English king. So then the English king owned the western portion of France, and that's what they fight over for the next 100 years.
oh, okay. This makes sense.
Yeah, so the when he's going to France, he's going specifically to try and keep control of this, so it's in the southwestern portion of France where the kind of like wine country region is. It's really beautiful part of France that you would want to have for
Right,
economics,
right.
really. Like there's a lot of reason to have it. It's beautiful land, especially when, so England up until right around this time would have had wineries, and they were growing good things and things were going well, but that really starts to end in this time period. So, a few years of bad wine coming out of England, you're like, well, I got to make sure that my French wine is still coming up tax free,
Hmm.
you know. So that's what that's about. So the marriage could have been brokered just to have a peace, and then there could have been like skirmishes, or I don't know what that would have been, because it's also made up. Like, he did marry a French princess in I think 1299 or something, but it's the king, it's not his son. But then there's all of these princesses that are like loosely related to the crown, because
Right,
there were a
right.
lot of kids during this time period. So there's a lot of options. They're always like pulling French nobility out of the monastery to like marry off, because they're like, well, we put her there to be safe. Let's get her out now, you know.
Yeah,
Um,
and it even seemed like in England and Scotland there were so many people that were rising in the ranks of nobility simply because they agreed or were bought out by the king.
Yeah. And that certainly was happening. I mean, the idea of, being a landed noble, needing to keep your landedness, because that's the only way you were making money. Like, you're farming, you're merchanting, or you're being a guy who owns land where people work it for you, you get their taxes and, their loyalty. Like,
Mm.
people like that power.
Yeah, oh, of course.
And that's just the feudal system, but that was the same everywhere.
I see. Um, shall we move on to something slightly more actiony about this war movie?
Yes, yeah. This is a war movie, but man, is a lot of it spent not doing war. But the parts that are doing war are very entertaining. I was
Yes.
fully entertained, fully there for the warfare portion of the movie, even if, it wasn't accurate either. But I mean, it felt accurate. It wasn't terrible.
Right. It has a lot of good things, but it's pretty inaccurate. There's a lot of great energy. I think it's all pretty well shot because you have these huge, like sweeping landscapes, and then you have, big wide angles of the forces charging at each other. Um, those shots of the arrows raining down on them, excellent stuff. Um, I especially like the siege where they have the giant tree that's a battering ram.
Hmm.
I think that's really cool. Also, didn't happen. Um,
Yeah. But
so
could have. That's
yeah,
not outside the realm of possibility.
yes, yeah,
And when they were pouring the oil down and catching fire, like all of that,
yes,
totally plausible in this
yes.
situation.
The weird thing about this movie is that while so much of it didn't happen the way the movie portrays it, it happened in other times, whether that was 1,000 years before or 200 years later. Like a lot of the tropes in this movie are things that kind of sort of maybe existed.
Yeah, yeah. It's not, in that way it's not completely fantastical.
Right.
I do think that an army of wild men armed with sticks and not actual weapons would have a hard time against a real English army from the 1200s. But,
Yeah. So let's talk about some of those weapons.
yeah.
Um,
None of
so
which depicted on this screen.
no. Well, actually, you do see the hilt of uh, William Wallace's
Oh,
longsword.
yeah. Yeah.
So he wields a longsword with two hands. This was very uncommon at the time. You would more likely have a sword and shield, especially if you're going up against arrows. Um, William Wallace's real like sigil or crest is a bow and arrow, so he'd be experienced with that, and we see a little bit of that in the movie. So very likely, if he's going into battle, he would have had a shield. Um, Also, he has a back scabbard. In the Middle Ages, that was only worn by Japanese samurai and Chinese soldiers. So we're stealing that from the complete opposite side of the world. And
Yeah,
in
and I mean, he went to Rome to study with the Pope. He didn't go to the Middle East or Kiev or
yeah, he didn't he
Russia.
Now there was a samurai who also came to meet the Pope, and he exchanged words with William Wallace about carrying a sword on your back because it looked really cool.
I
Uh,
mean, not outside the realm of possibility, but Chinese
nah,
soldier more than samurai. They
right,
weren't
right,
traveling as
right.
much, you know.
Um, yeah, so kind of weird things, but all of this is in an effort to make people look cool. In a similar way, a lot of the armor that's worn isn't hardly accurate at all. The most common things at this time were like chain mail that would be worn just about head to toe. There are a few costumes that are just like it looks like a leather coat, and then there are like little patches of metal like stapled to it, not studded, but like little sheets. That would be completely ineffective. It would be easy to slice through them or in between them or have an arrow go in between. Um, One thing that I do
Yeah.
think is really accurate is a lot of the shots with arrows. If you got shot by an arrow, you were very likely to die.
Hmm.
Unless it goes clean through, it is embedded in you until you're dead.
Yeah, unless
It's
you're a very important person too. Like the very important people, they developed some very bizarre technology to remove the arrow. Like there's a king or a prince, who later became king, who was crusading and he got shot with an arrow in his eyeball.
ow.
And they successfully removed the arrow from his skull. He could never see again out of that eye, and he lived a while after that, several years. Where when he continued to do more things that would get him shot with, arrows, but so like there is successful medical stuff that is able to happen in this time period, but in
Yeah,
general, you're an infantryman, they're leaving you to die.
yeah.
And that scene very specifically, the one where, you like see the battle and the aftermath and the mourners coming and like looking over the bodies, that was real. Like that scene, good scene. I believed in that. And that was heart-wrenching and
Hmm.
terrible and made me sad.
Um, Another idiosyncrasy was a lot of the war paints that they wore.
Oh
Uh,
yeah,
that would
terrible.
that wasn't a thing at this time. You got to go back about 1,000 years for people to be wearing lots of war paint. Um, Even well now, like the Navy SEALs do it, but or the Marines, they wear some paint.
Well, I think there's
Uh,
a difference between camouflage and war paint.
that's true. That's very
Yeah.
true.
I'm sure that, people were using camouflage when they were doing, things, but it
Yeah,
was closer to, highway robbing than it was actual warfare. Because too, you in general wanted your friends who were dressed the same as you and the bad guys. So the bad guys and the good
yes.
guys are wearing the same thing, everybody. They weren't wearing, wild man mullets versus, clean English haircuts. That wasn't the case. Everybody's wearing the same thing. So you
And
wanted to see people's faces so that you knew who was who.
and more than that, there are so many people that are wearing like heraldry on their shirts or on their tabards or cloaks, and
Hmm.
that was not very common at this time. That was quite the luxury. Most of what
Hmm.
people would be wearing would be things that they made themselves, and heraldry was more often displayed on shields at this
Yeah.
time. So it's very helpful for the viewer when
Hmm.
they run up to a camp that's full of people in orange coats and then it's going up against a bunch of people who are barely clothed. It's very helpful for us, but and visually striking, but again, inaccurate.
Yeah, and I don't mind that so much in the movie, because as you said, it does give you those cues. But I mean, they would have had flags, they would have had painted shields, all their tents would have been, in those colors. But yeah, the infantrymen would probably not have, had any heraldry on them. But the big guys you know, the cavalry, they probably would have had heraldry on their horses,
Hmm.
maybe on their tabards. They were definitely wearing funny feathers in their hats and on their helmets. They were carrying flags and standards,
What
all
are
those kinds of
standards?
things. So they're like it's like a giant flag. It's just a flag,
Oh,
Garrett.
okay.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
You know, yeah, but a
It
banner to
okay.
say like here we are, and they would use the banners and the standards in order to signal to the different like units
Yeah, they
of
did
what
that
they
in
were
this movie.
doing. Yeah, yeah. So like you would be moving around, and I remember reading about one battle where like people were fighting each other and then they looked up and they realized they were fighting their own side because things had gotten so like mishmashed on the battlefield. Like, ugh, yucky. That's why you need the standards.
Yeah.
And then when people change sides, it's very dramatic to see the standard move across to the other side. You know, very nice.
So along those lines, there's a scene in the movie where at the Battle of Falkirk, um, a bunch of Irish conscripts, they change sides when they like run ahead, and then they meet and there's like a handshake in the middle. I thought that
Yeah.
was very weird. Also, not only did this not happen, there were no Irish in these battles. They weren't brought over on the boats to fight against William Wallace. That didn't happen. But whatever, it was funny. Uh,
Yeah, it was just really weird. Like I don't even know like what was going on in the 90s that they were like, yeah, we need to get the Irish involved, you know? Like
a part of that is because of the friends of the podcast, the Irish Army Reserves. They're joining us again from last week's or 2 weeks ago, Saving Private Ryan. They're once again here as extras, 1,600 extras.
wow. So apparently if you want to be in a movie, go join the Irish Army Reserves.
Yes, you can fight in D-Day 1 year, and then a few years later, you can fight the English.
Yeah.
They were actually portraying both sides, so often they would like be switching costumes in between scenes, or just fighting against each other that way. But that's fun. That's definitely a way to get um, all the people involved. Uh, that's something we're going to talk about a lot with these war movies. Is there's usually a ton of people. Even in the Hurt Locker, there were tons of extras that were used because you need to combine like a sense of scale, and this is a great way to do it.
Yeah. Well, and I do think that's something that this movie did really successfully was while the battles themselves and what was going on in them and, you know, so much just like hurts me as a medievalist. On the other hand, it looked really good. It looked really clean. It looked believable. All the
Hmm.
maneuvers excited me. And I was like, oh, they're going to use the, you know, the sticks. Yeah, yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I liked it all. And then I read about it and was like, shit, this is all garbage. And the thing that actually happened was better. So,
Yes.
like, oh my God, like, why couldn't you just have done the battle?
Yeah, so the first big battle in the movie is the battle in the movie they call it the Battle of Stirling. In reality, it's the Battle of Stirling Bridge because there was a bridge. It was a bridge that was only wide enough to where two horses could go across it at a time, abreast. So not great. It was also wooden. Uh, by all accounts, that would have been one hell of a thing to see is people fighting over a bridge.
Yeah.
And nah, they did it in a field, but
Mhm.
that's it was still interesting, I guess, and not unlike other battles that would have been fought at this time.
Well, but at the same time, you know, so one medieval battle, you know, that so like if you're gonna know anything about medieval battles, the most important one that you think about is the Battle of Agincourt in France in the
Hmm.
1400s. Like that's the one you're gonna know about, and it was depicted in The King, which is starring Timothy Chalamet, very good movie, and they do that battle right. Um, like there are inaccuracies. I won't say there aren't. You know, like my friends will fight me about this, but like they captured the like medieval issues because medieval warfare, like in this movie, there are two major battles, and then they throw a bunch of weird siege shit in there that didn't actually happen.
Yeah.
But so this whole war, the Scottish War of Independence, has two battles. So, like, and that really underlines how important, the single battle was, and how the leaders weren't just going to throw everybody away to do this.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's not a good thing to do, to kill off your army in a stupid little skirmish. The medieval people, if they knew about the storming of Normandy, they would have just thrown a fit. Because they would have been
they
like, this was a bad idea. They would have walked over the Alps on elephants before they got on that beach. I'm telling you. But anyway, the thing about the bridge battle was, not only could you only take 2 horses over at a time, once they got to the other side, it was a swamp, and the horses all got stuck, and then they were being shot at, so they fell over, and everybody's in their armor, and they're in the mud, and they're just getting like destroyed by the Scottish, who had the higher ground and knew that this bridge was there, and it led into a swamp. Like, that's brilliant. That's good maneuvers, good techniques. Like, why couldn't we have seen that?
Yeah, so at the beginning of the film, William Wallace's mentor, his uncle, says to him, like, I won't teach you how to use a sword until I teach you how to use your mind. And I'm like, oh, okay, so we're gonna get a guy who's competent or tactical or doing stuff in court intrigue. He does very, very, very little of any of that. And to have like a scene or two where they, establish like, yeah, we're leading them into a trap would be really cool. Um, in a, it's not a sequel to this, but it stars Robert the Bruce, Chris Pine as Robert the Bruce. It's called Outlaw King. They have a similar scenario where they're up against, unfair odds, and they set a trap of like digging holes and making sure there's a lot of mud on the battlefield and doing a lot of stuff with like spikes and sticks that like set them up to have an advantage. And that's really cool.
Yeah, and I think I think that medieval warfare, and what we know about it, and what we know about these battles because they wrote about them, is so interesting. And I mean, you can learn a lot. Like, they were always, not always, but they were often very evenly matched. So the tactics that they had to use were interesting. Like, why can't we put those in the movie? Why do we have to resort to, just making shit up, where we, lift our kilts and, wag our stuff at the opposition? Like,
Yeah, it beats me. I think we mentioned before, but Mel Gibson got a Best Director credit for this as well.
So yeah, but so to go into more medieval warfare comments here, the second battle, which is the
Siege of York.
No, not that one.
No, not that one.
That didn't exist. So
no, they never got that far south.
No,
York is pretty far south.
That was dumb. And it didn't make any sense. Like, the Scottish they don't want York. Like,
their reasoning was a lot of battles and things had been staged out of here, but that was also a lie.
Yeah, I mean, like, so medieval warfare in general, like a siege or something like that, what you were doing is you were capturing some noble folks so you could ransom them off. Like, that's the goal of most battles. Like, you do. So if this was, like William Wallace and the King and everybody and Robert the Bruce, whatever, you would never kill them, because you could just capture them and ransom them off, and trade your ransom nobles, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
The infantry, they just died. Nobody cared. But anyway, so the other battle that I can't remember its name, because like this is like 2.5 hours into the movie, and I'm like, oh my god! But it's the one that the English win. Longshanks is there, and the English are doing well.
I'm pretty sure that's the Battle of Falkirk.
Falkirk. There we go. Yes. So that one, and that's the one where the Scottish cavalry leave the battlefield. And so that one
Yes.
is in general not too inaccurate. The idea was for the Scottish to get together in circles with their sticks, and so that they couldn't be charged at by the cavalry. But this backfired because the English had longbowmen who had a much better time at shooting them, and they were unprotected because it's hard to hold your stick and your shield at the same time.
Mhm.
And your shields aren't an impenetrable bubble around you. You got to be paying attention. And so that one is way closer to the scene in Game of Thrones. There's a battle, the Battle of the Bastards. That was terrible thing that I'm never watching again, but it was very well done, and it had lots of good maneuvers in it, and like, it's horrible stuff, but it worked. And this one, when I was reading about this battle, it reminded me a lot of that, of this like idea of using your archers, using these people to your advantage. And had the cavalry just like gone after the archers and taken them out, it would have been a different game. But
Mhm.
in the movie, they say that it's because deals were made behind the table, which is totally possible. In real life, it didn't look good for anybody once those longbowmen got out there, and they it in general, medieval warfare, you stopped fighting when you realized you were going to lose. You retreated. You got out of there. You gave up. You gave up the land. You gave up whatever you were doing, and then you made some kind of treaty and capitulated to your, oppressive overlords.
Yeah, because you
You
don't
married
want
off your
everybody to
daughters,
die.
etc.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, because these people have to go home and farm. Like, you want to eat, you want to have taxes, you can't kill all these people.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think that's enough of Caitlin bitching about medieval warfare.
Okay. So let's bitch about the runtime.
Yeah,
So
because holy shit, dude, this movie was too fucking long.
So this movie is 3 hours long and at times is incredibly boring. It does have some excellent scenes, some good direction. The action is clear and there are a lot of fun set pieces. There's also a really good score.
Yeah, the score was great. It's so funny. I was watching this movie and I didn't look it up, and I was like, I would bet money that this is the same guy that did Titanic.
And it
Because,
was.
yeah, it was. Some of the music, it's the same vibes. It's the same vibes, and it's very good. It's not overpowering. At times it's a little overly epic, but that was a thing in the 90s. Like, if
Yes.
you've seen
Yes.
any Kevin Costner movie, you would know what I'm talking about. Epic movies, epic songs. Woo. But I think they did a great job with it in this movie. Like, the
Yeah.
the music was great. It moved the pace along. It gave vibes to the cool shots. But holy shit, is this a long movie?
Yeah, I don't think we've mentioned, but there are some really breathtaking shots of the country. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's a very beautiful place. It's filmed in. Um, So originally, this movie was 3 hours and 15 minutes long. And one of the executives, I think, at Paramount said, this is too long. So they cut 18 minutes for the final cut, which is what we watched. Um, in 2016, Gibson said that there was a 4 hour cut. If Fox and Paramount wanted to work together, he would release it. And no thank you. That's just way too long for this. Don't get me wrong, I like a good movie, but there's not enough like interesting character things being happening. Like it's just rough. This movie is notable for winning the Best Picture and not having any nominations across the board for acting credits. It's one of less than a dozen films to do so across the Academy Awards and the Screen Actors Guilds Awards, which is it's just very weird. Usually, a Best Picture is propelled by the star. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and in this, so many of the characters are uh boring and uninteresting. Not to say there aren't, good moments, but just the through line is exhausting.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, king's son is the only one who has any, like quirky, interesting things to him. Like Wallace is surrounded by yes men. Wallace
Yes.
he does have some character development, but by the, first hour, he's just, rah 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 Scotland kill the English for the till the end. He never goes through any, development and change after that, which, makes sense in the context of the movie, but like he could have gone through something. He could have had a religious experience. He could have, like there could have been something. Like he could have seen somebody he loved die. In kind of like an Achilles Patroclus moment. You know, the other thing that really bothered me was the whole princess situation, especially because, you know, when William Wallace's wife dies, like they were very much like you're the only one I'll ever love, and they have those kinds of vows, and
Hmm.
you're the only one I'm ever going to be with, like toxic monogamy, like whatever. But like fine, if you're going to commit to that, commit to that. Don't sleep with the princess. Like you made all these vows that you were doing this for her, and now you're sleeping with this French lady and talking French to her? Like,
Yeah. Also,
yeah.
am I wrong to be surprised that he would know three languages?
Well, so if he went to a monastery, he would totally know Scottish, which he was born with, English, which he lived with, and French, which they taught in they would have only talked French. If it was a fancy nobles were there, they spoke French.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
So, I mean, it totally
I
depends on where this was. Like, did he say Rome?
yeah, he went to Rome on a
Okay.
pilgrimage.
So he definitely would have known Latin. And he's
Yes.
Catholic, so this makes sense. So I totally think that he could have known Scottish, French, and Latin, but he yeah, I guess it would be unlikely anyone would have spoken English in this movie. Because the Scottish would have spoke Scottish, the infantry would have spoke English, but the nobility would have spoke French because they were all French.
Yeah, and wasn't the king Welsh?
Yeah, okay, this goes to the whole like conquering of Wales and the Prince of Wales being like the king's son becomes the Prince of Wales, the King of
Hmm.
England. Like it's that whole thing had happened earlier in the
Okay.
1200s. So like yes, they would have been rulers of Wales. No, they would not have spoken Welsh. That would have been beneath
Okay.
them. Just like speaking English,
Okay. Well, luckily for us, people were speaking English in the movie.
Yeah, yeah, that is actually the biggest inaccuracy is that no one in this movie should have spoke English.
Interesting. Because I knew a lot of nobility spoke French, but I didn't realize it's just like, oh yeah, no,
Yeah,
that's really
until Henry
funny.
VIII. Like Henry VIII was one of the ones who was like, you know what, we're not going to be French anymore. Let's speak English. Like and he married all those English women too. Like that was a thing.
Yeah.
So it probably started a little earlier with like the Yorks and the Lancasters. They were speaking more English, but French because of the Norman conquest. 1066, the French conquer England. From then on, all the rulers are French.
Hmm.
And that's why they fight over France all the time.
Okay, this is starting to make more sense.
Yeah. At one point, the English king had a better claim to France than the French king. Like it got really weird in the next 100 years, which they should make many more movies about. They would be way more interesting than this.
So I guess on that note, what did we learn?
Um, yeah, this is not an accurate portrayal of anything.
So, as I was watching it, I was like, this really is an epic. This would go on to inspire Peter Jackson to make The Lord of the Rings. This was one of his huge inspirations for that because of how epic and grand so many of the battles and things were. And I really think if you change four names in the movie and you add in a dragon or maybe like a Pegasus or like a griffin or some fantastical element, you go from being this like inaccurate historical epic to being a fun fantasy romp because that's really what parts of it feel like. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so if we stop for a second and go, I don't care about the historical inaccuracies. You can have some fun with this movie, but I think this movie is best watched the way we probably watched it when it was on cable TV, where we just tuned in about every half hour to see the cool things going on and then left when the commercial break started.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I think that's the way to watch it because there's just so much happening in this movie that doesn't matter. And it's not like Lord of the Rings or Titanic where like having more would have helped. Like would have been better. Like there
Mhm.
is so much you can cut from this movie that I think you can cut like most of the first hour and most of the last hour. So, and it's a 3-hour movie.
Yeah.
Like, ugh. Yeah. But I do think a dragon would have improved it. And I mean, like there are good parts and
Yes.
it's a good epic and I'm sure in theaters it would have felt very grand and I think that it's very emotive and you do feel for these people and they do in that way I think that Mel Gibson did a good job
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
like being that person and currying that kind of respect and drive from these people to like free themselves from these oppressors, even if that's not what really happened. um yeah, is it good? Yes. Is it accurate? No. And we didn't even talk about the way he died, which is now on the screen. And this is an accurate representation of what they did not show us in the movie, which
We
I'm fine with them not showing us.
we should have used this picture for the last slide because we were talking about cutting.
Ah, yeah, yeah,
Uh, Missed opportunity there. But yeah,
yeah.
he received in my mind what's probably the worst way to kill somebody is being drawn and quartered, of just having four horses just rip you to bits.
Yeah, there were a lot of ways to get around this, and him being as high profile character as he was, he probably took some poison before this all went down. Um,
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, like, especially if his friends showed up, you know, like, yeah, I mean, punishments suck, but, you know, they knew how to make it less terrible, especially if he was that high profile of a person. Now, if
Mm.
he was just your, like, run of the mill, treasonous fellow from down the street, maybe not, but yeah. They did so the other thing was before they draw and quarter you, they take out your entrails and like wave them about.
Oh, so you're
Um
already dead.
I mean, you die pretty quickly after that
Hmm.
happens, yeah. Yeah. It depends. There were a lot of options. Depends on how sadistic the people were.
Look, we were very creative back then.
We were. We did not sleep with other people's wives, but we did tear people apart using horses and other torturous instruments.
So part of the reason we probably didn't get the whole end is because they were teetering through the whole movie on being the NC-17 rating, and then they got it
Ooh.
down to the R for brutal medieval violence. Um,
Wow. Well, I think we've changed our acceptable levels of grossness since 1995, for sure.
I mean, we changed it the next year with or we changed it a few years later with Saving Private Ryan. So
For
yeah.
sure. Yeah. Yeah, because I mean, I thought you were gonna say teetering on the edge between PG and R. That's
No,
fascinating to me.
no.
Well, how much was the kilt scene factoring in? Like that
Ooh,
much full frontal nudity? I think that might have been more of the issue.
well, it was more of the back, but yeah, I see what you mean. I from what I saw, it was more on the violence. But
Yeah.
it does show a lot of horses being hurt, which is a big
Hmm.
no-no. Um,
Yeah, and I mean you have rape, you have just like cutting people's throats. I mean there is a lot of violence happening,
yeah,
but like
people
that
being burned
violence was,
alive.
yeah,
Yeah.
that was, yeah, but that's all like stuff that would have happened. Wouldn't have happened every day, and it wouldn't have happened very often, but it certainly happened occasionally.
The movie does not do a good job explaining to you how long between events happen.
Hmm.
Because like this whole saga takes place over many years. Like the movie made it seem like it was, today we're doing this, tomorrow we're doing that, then on Friday we got a siege. We can't be late to the battle on Saturday.
See, I actually thought the opposite. I thought
Really?
that it made it take place over a longer period than it did. Well, maybe because the English only occupied Scotland for like 2 years before
Yeah.
all this went down. And then there was a few years in between each of the major battles, and that's mainly because all the other stuff they didn't actually happen. So, yeah. I mean, I just also, like intrinsically, I have the brain of like, oh, it takes, to walk from Glasgow to York. Okay, like that's that many miles, so it'll probably take, yeah.
Yeah, when he said he went to Rome, I was like, that took you probably 3 years. Like,
No, you could probably do that in a year.
well, I mean there and back. Like,
Yeah, yeah, there
it,
and back in a year, I think is
really.
solid. Yeah.
Oh, I've
Well, because
no
yeah.
concept of distance in this foreign continent.
Well, so think about it. The pilgrimage in Spain that goes from the Pyrenees in France to Santiago de Compostela in on the ocean, that takes 35 days.
Okay.
So, you just multiply that by, a few. I mean, you could probably walk from Calais in France to Santiago de Compostela, which was the other big pilgrimage place. I mean, you could probably do that in like 4 or 5 months. So I think Rome is totally possible, especially if you had a horse. If you had a horse, like,
Well,
three
you got to
months
get
maybe.
the horse across the ocean or across
They
the
had boats. They were always going back and forth on boats. People did die in those boats often, but,
Well, I'm glad William Wallace's story didn't end dying on a boat when he went to go to Rome. Uh,
yeah.
his myth, his legend, what it meant for the Scottish people, it inspired so much. It inspired a few poems that went on to inspire this movie, which reignited a lot of passion and interest in the subject. And I'm glad we got to touch on a lot of that today.
Yeah, I'm glad we got to do a medieval war movie for War on Christmas. Because, obviously medieval times are my jam and I love this stuff. And I'm sure that there are things that I was inaccurate with too. But I hope that, you will, as a viewer, you will be inspired to go read some good books and listen to some good podcasts. There's great, YouTube videos and podcasts out there that diagnose these issues, the inaccuracies, even, better than I did, certainly.
Oh yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, like go if you find medieval warfare interesting, go look at the maps of those battlefields because they're fascinating. Like these are cool little battles that they were doing. Um, yeah.
I built a trebuchet when I was a kid, so I like all this stuff. There wasn't a trebuchet in this movie, which is disappointing. I like siege engines. Um, but there were no sieges. So, well,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, and like it, I think that whole like the York siege thing was a wooden town, right?
It looks stone, but they did set a lot of stuff on fire.
Yeah. So, I mean, you don't need a siege engine if everything's made of wood and you can just burn it. Um,
That's true, but they're really cool.
they are really cool. They are really cool, and the English were using them on the French, and the French were using them on the English when they were fighting
Yeah.
in France. So just imagine Longshanks ordering a bunch of siege engines about. Yeah.
I mean, it's fun. I think that's why we enjoyed talking about this one. These ideas are a lot of fun, despite how absolutely horrifying and grim the realities are.
Yeah. Yeah, medieval times not a fun time to live, especially the 1300s. It
No,
got really bad really quick. Um all of
we,
this will be forgotten in the next 10 years as everyone in this movie dies of the plague. So, yeah.
yeah, that's the bleak thing I was reminded about when I was like, wait a minute, doesn't the plague happen soon?
Yeah. Yeah, between the weather and the plague, the next 75 years are turmoil. And then, you have these issues where nobody knows. So like, this is the first Scottish War of Independence, and it's brought on by a succession dispute. The next 200 years, the British Isles are nothing but succession disputes.
Oh yeah, yeah, with everybody dying, yeah,
Yeah. Well, and people suddenly not being able to have as many kids.
yeah, because you
Maybe
can't support them. Yeah.
the bloodlines might have been a little bad at that point too. Might be a little interconnected, we'll say. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. Talk in the comments about your favorite wartime period this time. I want to hear about which is better, Romans, Greeks, medieval people, Renaissance, where you get the cannons, Revolutionary War, where you get really dumb musket ball situations, Civil War, where you get the Gatling gun, very
Ooh, ooh.
fun innovations. World War One, where you have trenches, World War Two, where you have tanks and airplanes, Korea, where I don't know anything about Korea, Vietnam, where you have napalm, or Iraq, where you have suicide bombers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, join us next time when we look at another war from the past and see how they portrayed it in film. Um,
Yeah, not sure which one we're going with yet, but we look forward to seeing some violence.
yeah. Well, thank you, everybody, and we hope you enjoyed.